Hello, YouTube divers. This is WaterDive 122, and I want to welcome you all to another episode of Magic Metal Mondays. Today, we are going to be doing a top 5 albums of the year. Now, I know I did something similar like this a couple months ago, where I ran through my favorite albums through 10 years from 1970 all the way to the year of my birth, 2005. But today I decided to do a little bit more digging, and I decided to do my top 5 albums from a specific year. We're going completely out of order. These are completely random years. We're going to jump right into it. There's a lot of great albums here, especially for the year that we're going to be talking about. We're going to be talking about my top 5 favorite albums from 1987. And of course, I will give out 3 honorable mentions at the very end. I'll do a brief explanation as to why they are honorable mentions and not really on the list yet. So, without further ado, let's get started. Coming in at number 5, this is a brand new entry on the list. I listened to this album a couple weeks ago, and I was blown away. I mean, this is a legendary album by a legendary band. We are talking about Dream Evil from Dio. Now, this was a big album for Dio. I mean, it wasn't as big as, like, Holy Diver, for example, or at least in my opinion. But this is a freaking killer album. I mean, everything from the title track to Night People, to Naked in the Rain. There's a lot of great songs on here. Ronnie James Dio is in his prime. The guitar work is phenomenal, especially on the title track. But mainly this is just about Ronnie James Dio and his iconic voice. I mean, what more really is there to say about Dream Evil? It's a classic. It's not really as good as Holy Diver, but that album is tough to find success because it's like with the aforementioned Dream Evil, it is a freaking classic. But Dream Evil, without a doubt, is one of the best albums in the Dio catalog, and yeah, I love this record. Definitely made a huge impression on me, so that's why it's here. Number 5. Number 4, Under the Sign of the Black Mark by Bathory. Black metal legends. I did a whole album review for this album. You could go back and check that out. I talk more about why I love this album the way that I do, and it's personally another one of my favorite metal albums. Yeah, I do think Blood, Fire, Death is a better album, but just by like the slightest of margins, but still, Under the Sign of the Black Mark is an absolute masterpiece. I mean, everything from Woman of Dark Desires to Enter the Eternal Flame to, Equimanthorn, to Corthon's excruciatingly amazing black metal screams on here. I know I've said his name is Quanthorn, but no, that's you all know that's wrong. His name is Corthon. He plays. He not only sings, he also does guitars on this album and on Blood, Fire, Death. And I think he's one of Bathory's guitarists. He does an amazing job on here. And I gotta tell you, that dude has some talent. Doing black metal screams while playing insane guitar riffs and solos is just out of this world. But yeah, with that said, Under the Sign of the Black Mark coming in here at number 4. If you want more information on why I like this album so much, go check out my album review that I did for this album, and I talked a little bit more about it there. So there you go. Number 3 is another classic album. It's an album from one of my all-time favorite bands, Anthrax. Yeah, you know what I'm talking about. Among the Living. If you remember from my Anthrax album rankings, I ranked this one at number 2, mainly because, looking back on it now, between Among the Living and my favorite Anthrax album, Spreading the Disease, I think I can pinpoint why I like Spreading the Disease more. Because in my honest opinion, if there is one weakness, if there is one weakness that Among the Living has for me, is that it just doesn't hit you as hard as Spreading the Disease does. Joey Belladonna's vocals, whilst they're still great, nonetheless, they're just not as good as they are on Spreading the Disease. The production is also a little bit dry. Like, you can't really hear the guitars that much. I mean, it's not as clear and shiny as it is on Spreading the Disease. And whilst Among the Living does have more memorable songs like Indians, Con the Mosh, NFL, Imitation of Life, a lot of classic stuff on here. I Am the Law. This album just, to me, it just doesn't feel as punchy and more, heavy hitting than Spreading the Disease does. But even with all that stuff, that's just my own personal taste on Anthrax. But this album, in talking about the years, and talking about the albums that came out in 1987, which was a phenomenal year for metal. Lots of great metal albums came out in 1987, as we all know. This album is killer, and I definitely think it deserves the praise and grace that it gets, not just from Anthrax fans, not just from thrash metal fans alike, but the entire metal community. I mean, the entire metal fandom knows what a great album this is. There's no doubt that this is a staple in the metal catalog. And as a result, it ends up here at number 3. Now these next two out, and the reason why it's at number 3, because these next two albums are on a whole nother level. So let's talk about them, shall we? Now, these two albums, I will say, they are amazing. I mean, they're more than classics. They're more than staples. They are possibly some of the best metal material ever released. These albums are so heavy hitting that they should be high on not just my list, but on anyone's list. There's no doubt that these next two albums that I'm about to talk about are absolutely killer metal albums. And I suggest to anyone who's just getting into the following two bands that I'm about to talk about, check out these albums. So let's talk about album number 2 on our list. Like with Dream Evil, this is a album that I recently got into. But my oh my, this album is amazing. This is a masterpiece. We are talking about Hall of the Mountain King by Savatage. Now, like with Under the Sign of the Black Mark, I did a whole album review on this. You can check that out if you want to. But just to sum it all up in one quick sentence, no, like a couple of sentences or something like that, I don't freaking know. Hall of the Mountain King is an absolute masterpiece. Not just in the prog metal genre, but one of the best metal albums ever created. And it is definitely a gem for any metalhead who happens to stumble across this record, and for this band. I've already talked about Savatage to death on this channel, as I frequently mention. So, as I've said, I've reviewed 4 of their albums. I've done a song ranking for them. I've done an album ranking for them. And now here I am again talking about, without question, their best album, Hall of the Mountain King. I mean, from the title track to Strange Wings to Legions to 24 Hours Ago, Beyond the Doors of the Dark, Devastation. There's just so many phenomenal tracks on this record. Too much for me to count on. I mean, ironically, there's like 9 songs. You could basically say that all of them are great. All of them are great. There is not a bad song on this album. This is a freaking masterpiece. I mean, what more is there to say? Um, John Oliva is in his prime on this album, in my opinion. Chris Oliva has, without a doubt, some of my favorite Savatage guitar solos, especially if you look in the title track and on 24 Hours Ago. Woo! And of course, Steve Wacholtz and Johnny Lee Middleton round out the um, rhythm section, and of course, they round out my favorite lineup of Savatage. I know I've talked about it to death. Let's move on before I talk about Savatage much longer here. And now, if you remember from my top 10, my favorite albums from the 1980s video that I did, I kind of talked. You already know what's gonna be my number one. But before we get to that, we're going to do my 3 honorable mentions here. So we have Legacy by Testament. This album still needs time to grow on me, but from what I've heard thus far, it is a freaking amazing album. Second honorable mention goes to Hysteria by Def Leppard. Def Leppard is one of my favorite metal bands. Yes, you could say that they're party rock, but Pyromania from '83 is a metal album. And there's a lot of like glam metal moments here on this album too. I mean, look at Pour Some Sugar on Me, the amazing ballad that is Love Bites. I mean, of course, the title track as well. Everything. I don't need to talk about it. And then the last honorable mention goes to Guns N' Roses' Appetite for Destruction. They're one of the best debut albums ever made. So many classic songs on here. Like with Among the Living, this is a classic that pretty much every single metal or hard rock fan knows. I mean, Welcome to the Jungle, Paradise City, Sweet Child of Mine. The list just goes on. The best lineup of Guns N' Roses, best performances from the band, best vocal performances from Axl Rose, best guitar solos from Slash. I mean, the list just goes on. This is a phenomenal album. But it didn't make my top 5. These albums didn't really make my top 5. I had Hysteria and Appetite for Destruction in my top 5, but I like Dream Evil so much, and Under the Sign of the Black Mark. I like both those albums so much that I had to put them higher. But there's still, all of these albums are freaking amazing. Alright, now let's talk about my number 1 album from 1987. My number 1 album from 1987, the first time I heard it, I was blown away. This is a legendary album from the greatest metal band of all time, in my opinion. We are talking about Keeper of the Seven Keys Part 1 by Helloween. Now, despite this album being my number 1 from 1987, this is not my favorite Helloween album. You already know what my favorite Helloween album is. It's Keeper 2. But Keeper 1 is just as good. I will make a video on my top 5 albums from 1988, and when I talk about Keeper 2, I will explain why I like that album a little bit more than Part 1, rather. But Part 1, from top to bottom, it's amazing. Everything from I'm Alive to the amazing way to close the album with Tale That Wasn't Right, Future World, and Halloween. All of these are great. And I also did an album review for this album as well. Please go check that out. But overall, Keeper of the Seven Keys Part 1, even though it's not really as good as Keeper 2, in my opinion, it is still a freaking amazing album. It's a 10 out of 10. It's a perfect record. This album is on a whole nother level compared to these albums that we just talked about. So with that said, that concludes this edition of Magic Metal Mondays. Thank you so much for watching, my fellow YouTube divers. This is WaterDive 122 signing out, ready to dive into more fun on YouTube. Thanks for watching.